Hello, family, whom I love so much. Welcome to another character trait lesson. We've been talking about the character trait of courage. We talked about how we need to face our fears, and our last lesson was about how we need to have the courage to be glad that we're who we are. You know, there's no other person in the whole wide world like Jason or like Sawyer. We must delight in ourselves and who we are. Do you know, courageous people are still afraid. Being courageous doesn't mean we're not afraid. Those who are courageous are still afraid, but they move forward knowing that what they need to do is important. They face those fears, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to learn about how to stand up for what we believe. What are some of the things that we believe in that we might have to stand up for? Well, we believe that we have a Heavenly Father who loves us and has given us commandments. These commandments are things that we might have to stand up for as we try to live them and do what's right. We believe that we have that Jesus Christ is our Savior and Redeemer. This is something that we might have to stand up for. We believe that it's important to be kind to each other. This is something we might have to stand up for. Much of the world that we live in nowadays doesn't have these same beliefs. They believe in completely different things. Much of the world, many people in the world believe that doing evil things is good and being righteous and trying to live right is bad. And so there'll be incidences when you are going to have to stand up for what you believe. I remember a time when Aunt Suze was just a little young freshman girl in college, 18 years old, and she had signed up for a psychology class. And she quickly learned that the teacher in that class did not believe in God, did not have the same beliefs that she did, and just did have no values at all. And one day they were talking about a certain subject, and she had to either pretend that she didn't care or she had to stand up. So I remember her coming home to Alamo and sitting down and putting together a paper that presented what she believed that was completely against what the professor wanted or believed. But she wrote that paper and she turned it in. And she talks about remembering now, even today, that was probably one of her poorest grades, but she stood up for what she believed. What are some of the things that you might have to stand up for in your life, in your little situations? How about some of your friends are saying nasty jokes, or you hear someone taking the Lord's name in vain? I remember a story about President Kimball. He was in the hospital and he was having to have serious surgery on his throat. And the young hospital attendant, he was on one of these rolling hospital beds, and there was a hospital attendant pushing him, and he bumped the bed accidentally into the wall. And the young attendant used a very profane word, taking the Lord's name in vain 2 or 3 different times and angrily. And President Kimball, even as sick as he was, and with all of the preparations, the drugs and things in his body, getting ready for this surgery, looked at that young attendant and says, "Oh, please, you are talking about my best friend." And the young attendant realized what he had done and really felt bad and never did it again, and President Kimball was able to teach him as he stood up for what he believed. I'm thinking there are going to be times when you're going to have to stand up for believing in Jesus Christ. What else? There'll be many, many situations where you're going to have to stand up and believe. And let's see, when we do stand up and have the courage to face people who are saying things that we don't believe in, or making fun of what we do believe, it's important that we never use anger, that we are calm and courteous and courageous. And as we do that, that will give us a self-esteem for standing up for our values. We will feel good about ourselves. If we don't, we'll just feel guilty and feel horrible. And generally speaking, when people stand up for what they believe in a kind, courteous ways, other people will respect them, even though they do not believe what we believe. President Nelson said, listen to this, "True disciples of Jesus Christ are willing to stand out, speak up, or be different from the people of the world." And that reminded me of a story of young Joseph Fielding Smith. Joseph F. Smith, actually, is how we know him, as Joseph F. Smith. He was Hyrum Smith's son. And remember, Hyrum was killed with Prophet Joseph Smith in the Carthage jail. As a young man, probably 15 years old, he was sent on a mission to Hawaii. And that took a lot of courage for this young boy to go clear across the ocean. But he served there for 4 years, and now it's time for him to come home, and he lands in San Francisco. And he and another group of saints are leaving from San Francisco and coming to Salt Lake, and they are on foot or with wagons and horses, and they're coming. And this one particular evening, they stop to camp for the night, and as they're preparing to their campsite, here comes a small mob of ruffians. Let me tell you what happened. Let me read to you what happened. As these bad men rode up to their camp, the other LDS men ran and hid. But Joseph F. Smith decided there was nothing to be afraid of. And so he continued piling firewood on the fire. And as he did so, one of the men approached him with a pistol, declaring that it was his duty to exterminate every Mormon he came in contact with. What does it mean to exterminate? That means to kill, to get rid of. And so this man believed that he was to kill every Mormon. So Joseph F. Smith had this pistol pointing at him. What is he going to do? And the man said, "Are you a Mormon?" Without fear or hesitation, Joseph answered, "Yes, sirree, dyed in the wool, true blue, through and through." The man was so startled by the courage of young Joseph F. Smith that he dropped his pistol and said, "Well, you are the," and then he used some bad words, "pleasantest man I have ever met. Shake, young fellow. I am glad to see a man that stands up for his convictions." Took a lot of courage, but that's what he did. Something else that takes a lot of courage is to look people in the eye as you're talking to them. When we do that, that shows confidence. That shows that we're pleased with ourselves, we're confident with ourselves, and that we're confident of these other people. Looking them in the eye, eye to eye. So what we're going to do, we're going to have an eye-to-eye activity. I want you to turn the video off, pause it for a minute, and with those people in your family, create situations that you're going to have to stand up for what you believe. That's going to take courage for you to stand up for what you believe. create these little pretend situations, and then one of you be the bad guy or the opposing person, and the other one be the person that has to stand up for what you believe, and look at that person eye to eye as you're standing for what you believe. Go ahead and do that now. Pause the video and then come back after you've done several little practices eye to eye with the different people in your group. So, how did it go? I'm going to end with a story, a true story, about a little girl by the name of Ruby Bridges. And I remember this story. I was a young girl, and Ruby was about my age as a young girl when this happened. And about how she had to face up with courage. This book is written by Robert Coles, and it's illustrated by a man by the name of George Ford. And that's a picture of Ruby. I was about this age when this true story happened. I remember it. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylerton, Mississippi. We were very, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops. So my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, the judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonald's. 16-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. So do you understand what's happening? Ruby's going to go to a school where there are no other black children. She will be the only white child in that school. Think about the courage that's going to take. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. So, the President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns. Look how angry those parents are. They weren't going to have their children go to school with a little black girl. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that same kind of school day. So not only just for a day, not for just a week, but for months, she had to deal with those angry parents. Ruby walked to the front school surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed towards her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a single word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, to eat with. She was just alone. Let me show you the picture, actually. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I have ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom and an empty building. Sometimes, said her teacher, I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, how she went by those mobs and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing just fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she gradually began to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. So, one girl, one teacher in a whole huge school building, because the white parents, the parents with the white skin, would not let their children go to school with this little black girl. Then, one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She just stopped dead, and these people are just all around her, yelling and screaming and calling her names. Ruby stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. So see, the teacher's watching what's going on outside the window, but the teacher can't hear what's going on. Any ideas? What do you think Ruby's doing? What do you think she's saying? What would you do? What would you say? How would you stand up for what you believed? Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby would not budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. Okay. Here are the marshals. These are the policemen. That's another word for policemen, protecting Ruby. And look how angry all of the people are at her. What is she saying? When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. I didn't stop and talk with them, she said. Ruby, I saw you. Mrs. Henry said. I saw your lips moving. I wasn't talking, said Ruby. I was praying. I was praying for them. Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. So she usually stopped quite a ways away from the school and said a little prayer and asked Heavenly Father to bless those people that were mean to her. But this day she had forgot to stop and pray. And so when she got to the mob, she stopped and asked Heavenly Father to bless them, and these people were listening. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day before and after school, and this is the prayer. Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. And those marshals are standing there watching. And that's the end. Eventually, the parents realized that their kids weren't getting any education, and so they let the kids go back to school. And Ruby was still the only black girl in that whole school, but it turned out better. And now look at today, how good our schools are integrated with all of the different mixes, because Ruby was courageous and her family were courageous. Okay, remember, young people, that as we stand up for what we believe, we gain good respect for ourselves, and other people usually will respect us also. And so your assignment this week is to practice looking people in the eye when you're conversing with them, when you're telling them a story, when you're listening. Look people in the eye. That's part of being courageous and having the courageous trait in us. Always remember how much I love you, and always remember how wonderful each of you are.